I'm Lauren Walker, 35, and today I buried my husband, Ethan, on the far side of the world. After more than 30 hours in the air and in layovers, I landed at PDX and messaged our family group to ask if someone could pick me up. The typing dots blinked. Replies trickled in. Everyone was busy. Maybe I should have planned better. My fingers trembled. I answered, "No worries," and stood still by the carousel like I hadn't just been cut open. If you've ever needed someone and met only quiet, you know the hollow that followed me home. Before grief rewrote my days, my life looked steady and good. We first crossed paths in college, tied the knot after we graduated, and made our home in Portland. I worked as a marketing director. He thrived in his field. A decade together slipped by in an easy rhythm. We traveled when we could and hosted game nights with friends, the kind of simple weekends that felt like proof we were doing all right. Our place wasn't fancy, but it felt like ours. Walls full of pictures, a calendar crowded with little plans, a table that always seemed to fit one more chair. Then his company offered a 6-month contract in Singapore. It felt exciting and a little unreal. We talked it through, looped in our families, and decided he should take it. He told me it would strengthen his skills and give us a chance to experience living abroad together. I arranged to work remotely for 3 months so I could be there part of the time, December through February, so we wouldn't spend the whole stretch apart. We sketched out plans, compared calendars, and circled holidays we'd try to share. He promised the opportunity would make our future even brighter. 6 months will fly, he said at the airport, his fingers intertwined with mine. We set small rules to make the distance bearable. Call every morning, send photos of ordinary days, say the hard parts out loud. He learned the train lines, where meetings were held, and which corner stall made the lunch he kept craving. I learned to count hours forward and backward until our windows overlapped, and to fill evenings with errands and friends so the nights wouldn't swallow me. We adjusted. We found a routine that held even when it felt thin. When I visited, he introduced me to his coworkers and the places he loved. We ate at hawker centers he'd described on our calls, and on weekends we took ferries to neighboring islands and wandered until our feet ached in the heat. He pointed out buildings that glittered after dark. I took pictures of everything and sent them home. It felt like we were opening a door together, getting a taste of living abroad while his career grew. We told each other it was worth it, that the months would pass, that we were still us, just stretched across an ocean and a few time zones. Everything felt steady, almost charmed. We'd started making real plans again, talking about when I'd come back in spring, and we finally began seriously discussing having a child. Then one weekday morning, he mentioned a headache that wouldn't ease. "It's probably just stress," he said, rubbing at his temples. A huge deadline was bearing down. 8 hours later, a coworker rang from Ethan's phone. His voice was careful, like he was trying not to frighten me, as he said Ethan had collapsed during a meeting, and the ambulance had taken him to the hospital. By the time I reached the ICU, a neurosurgeon had already met with his team. A brain aneurysm. They rushed him into emergency surgery. When the surgeon finally came out, she spoke gently about damage and outcomes, words that sounded clinical and impossible all at once. For the next 5 days, I sat at his bedside and held his hand. Machines hummed, monitors beeped in restless rhythms I tried to decode. I watched the rise and fall of his chest and told him everything I could think to say. I asked questions through translation apps and hurried interpreters, repeating details until I memorized them. I slept in a chair and woke to nurses changing lines before dawn. Each afternoon I called home, desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't falling apart alone. I wanted love, a voice that would steady me. What I heard back were suggestions and schedules. Could I sign things faster? Could I pack sooner? Maybe I should come home and sort out insurance while coworkers handled local tasks. I kept saying I couldn't leave him. I couldn't imagine getting on a plane while he lay there, his hand warm in mine, the rest of him far away. Not like that. Not in a place where the only people who knew him were colleagues he'd just met. When the surgery team told me the damage was catastrophic and that we should prepare for the worst, the room seemed to tilt. After he was gone, Someone gently explained what repatriation would cost, how paperwork had to be exact, how certain procedures had to follow local customs. The numbers made my breath catch. Bringing him home would take weeks and more money than I had. So I chose a funeral in Singapore. It was small and painfully quiet. A few of his co-workers came and 2 expats he'd eaten lunch with twice. We stood under a pale, cloudless sky and said goodbye, half a planet away from everyone who'd ever loved us. I kept running out of words. Grief was a tide. I let it pull me under because fighting it hurt more. Our insurance covered a portion. The rest landed on my credit cards and in whatever savings we'd planned to use for a future that no longer existed. International policies have tiny print that turns molasses thick when you're crying. Flights, a short-term rental, legal notarizations, the mortuary's fees, the service itself. None of it cared that I was his wife and not a logistics firm. From my family, I got short messages, a few practical links, and the sense that my pain was an inconvenience. In truth, I shouldn't have been surprised. They had a way of centering their own joy around my milestones, finding some side drama that became the main act. Once, they even managed to make a celebration about us into a debate over who someone was dating, like bringing the wrong girlfriend mattered more than toasting my marriage. Ethan would squeeze my hand later and say we couldn't change them, only how much power we allowed them to take. After the funeral, the hardest part wasn't done. Offices with numbers I couldn't memorize, counter windows that closed just as I arrived, forms that needed the same data 3 different ways. I repeated dates and full names through a throat that kept closing, listened carefully so I wouldn't make errors that could cost another week. Every person I met was polite, and still I felt like I was failing a test in a language I didn't speak. At night, I would unlock the rental, turn on one light, and sit among his things. I wrapped shirts that smelled like him and slid his notebooks into a suitcase. I made neat piles that weren't neat at all once I noticed his handwriting in the margins. I talked to him in a whisper, told him what I was taking home, promised I'd keep safe the pieces of our life other people might not understand. The watch I'd given him for our 5th anniversary went into my carry-on. I couldn't stand to check it. His favorite paperbacks. I kept one of his hoodies out for the flight because planes are always cold and grief is colder. I locked the door, double-checked the zippers, and looked around the room one last time. My journey home stretched over 30 hours. The trip home stretched into a blur of gates and stale air. By the time the wheels hit the runway at PDX, my body didn't feel like mine. I followed the stream of passengers to baggage claim and stood under the monitors, trying to breathe. Families clustered in little circles around me, laughing and wrapping arms around shoulders. I watched the carousel start up and waited for pieces of our life to come around on a belt. My first suitcase slid by and I dragged it off. The second one, his, appeared tilted, the zipper stressed from how tightly I'd packed it. I stepped toward it, hands outstretched, just as it jolted off the curve. The case hit the floor and sprang open like a jaw. His shirts and notebooks spilled, the hoodie I'd kept out for warmth tumbling onto the scuffed tile. A paperback popped free and skittered under the belt guard. For a second, I just stared. Then I was on my knees, gathering what I could, pressing clothes to my chest while the belt kept circling. A baggage handler jogged over with a roll of tape and a stack of those plastic overflow bags. "Let me help," he said. Already scooping up the papers I couldn't make my fingers close around. Another agent slid a bin my way and we tucked everything into it. Shirts folded enough to keep from wrinkling, books stacked, the zipper coaxed back together and strapped with tape. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" he asked when we'd wrangled the last sock. "No," I said. My voice came out thin. "I'll get an Uber." He nodded like he understood too much and not nearly enough. "Take your time. If you need a cart, they're over there." He looked at the taped seam and added, "It'll hold." "Thank you," I said, because I didn't know how to say what it meant that someone had knelt on a dirty floor to help me hold my life together for 5 minutes. Outside, the air bit at my lungs. I ordered a car and watched the little icon inch its way toward me on the screen. While I waited, I hugged the hoodie to my chest. It still smelled like him. Soap, coffee, something warm I couldn't name. When the driver pulled up, He lifted my bags into the trunk without making me relive the story. We drove past signs I could read in my sleep, across bridges that had framed so many of our weekends. Portland looked the same and completely different, like a stage set left up after the actors had gone home. He asked if I preferred silence or music, and I picked silence. The city slipped by in dark panes and sodium light. I pressed my forehead to the cool window and thought about how many times Ethan and I had taken this route, how we'd swapped stories about our days as if we had all the time in the world. The driver turned down our street and I tried to picture the porch light glowing, the inside warm, the small kindnesses that would say, someone had been here to get it ready. The porch was dark. The bulb had burned out sometime while I was gone. I hauled my suitcases up the steps and fumbled with the key, fingers stiff from cold and travel. The lock resisted like a stranger. When the door finally gave, a wave of cold air spilled out so sharp it made my eyes water. My breath fogged in front of me. The house felt hollow, like sound would echo if I spoke. I dropped the bags just inside and went straight to the thermostat. The screen lit up to a temperature that made no sense for winter. I had asked for the heat to be raised the day before I landed. No one had touched it. I nudged it higher and listened for the furnace to wake. Somewhere in the walls, metal ticked and settled. I stood there until the vents gave a tired sigh and a thread of lukewarm air crept out. The mail slot had done what it could. Envelopes sat heaped under it like a snowdrift made of catalogs and bills. Packages leaned against the door where I might have tripped over them in the dark. I stacked everything on the entry table and peeled off my shoes. The floor was so cold it numbed the skin through my socks. In the kitchen, the fridge light flicked on, bright and useless. Half a jar of jam, condiments, and a bottle of seltzer that had gone flat. The list I'd texted, eggs, bread, fruit, soup, would have made a dozen meals. The shelves looked like a shrug. I closed the door and leaned my head against it until the chill sank into my skull. I walked through the rooms on autopilot, touching surfaces to prove the house was still real. Pillows on the couch where we'd watched movies. A plant drooped by the window I'd carefully moved it to last fall. The table where we'd left a puzzle half finished. Dust had gathered in the quiet like a thin, accusing veil. I opened a few blinds and let the street glow in, then shut them again. It wasn't light I needed. Back in the bedroom, I set his taped suitcase next to mine and unzipped, just enough to check that everything had survived the spill. The watch case was still there in my carry-on. The hoodie I'd brought on the plane went onto the chair by the bed. I sat down and felt the springs complain under the sudden weight. Then I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The furnace clicked, then went silent again. The pipes moaned somewhere in the walls like an old house learning to breathe. I should have showered. I should have eaten something. Instead, I pulled the hoodie over my pajamas and tucked my hands into the sleeves. My phone buzzed with a message I didn't have the energy to read. The screen lit the room with a blue I hated. I turned it face down. I told myself that coming home would be a step, maybe not forward, but at least onto ground that didn't tilt. Standing in our doorway proved me wrong. Home was just another place where he wasn't. I curled on top of the covers and tried to listen past the clatter in my head for the sound of air moving through vents. The house stayed cold. The quiet pressed in. I let my eyes close because there was nothing else left to do. Morning came with a sound I couldn't place at first, wet and restless like a sink left running in another room. I pushed back the blanket and the cold slapped my skin, sharper than it had been the night before. The house felt even more hollow than when I'd fallen into a half sleep. I shuffled toward the hallway, every board creaking in the quiet. In the kitchen, I reached for the switch, and the light snapped onto a scene that made my stomach drop. Water was streaming from a jagged split in the ceiling, pouring in ribbons over the cabinets and onto the tile. It hammered the counter, overflowed the sink, and chased itself across the floor in shining sheets. I waded forward, shoes soaking through in seconds, and yanked open the utility closet where the main shut-off valve sat. The metal wheel burned my fingers with its icy bite as I twisted with both hands. Pipes moaned in the walls. Somewhere near the dining room, I heard a fizzing sizzle from a light fixture and swore under my breath. Of course. After everything else, of course, my return would come with a flooded house. Portland had been locked in a deep freeze all week. The supply line must have frozen overnight and split open when it thawed. A hysterical laugh bubbled up and died in my throat. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and reached for my phone. The first emergency plumber I called was backed up for days. So was the second, and the third. "We're slammed," a dispatcher told me, harried but not unkind. "Everyone's got burst pipes." I stared at the water, making a mirror of my kitchen floor, and tried to keep my voice steady. "There's water dripping from light fixtures," I said. "The furnace isn't keeping up. I can't be here alone." I called Brandon. He answered on the fourth ring, distracted, television noise loud behind him. "That's rough," he said after I rushed through the situation. "Did you try other plumbers? Maybe check Angie's list or watch a couple of how-tos. People are fixing this stuff themselves right now." "Brandon," I said carefully, fighting not to cry, "I can't stay here. There's water in the fixtures and almost no heat. Could I crash with you until someone can come out?" He went quiet long enough for me to hear a can open and someone laugh in the background. "Did you call Mom and Dad yet?" he asked, finally, like the answer might save him from saying yes. I closed my eyes. I told him I would. "Keep me posted," he said, already fading. "I've got a thing later." I tried my parents. My mother picked up with apologies unspooling before I could finish hello. "Oh, honey, you know your father has an early morning, and I've already committed to something for church. This whole week has been a lot." She told me to see what the insurance would cover, to make a list of damages, to stay on top of the situation. My father got on just long enough to suggest I find a space heater and to say the roads were bad where they lived. "Be careful," he added in a voice meant to be kind but landing like a shrug. By then, I'd gone more than a day without a real meal. Jet lag and grief had chewed through any energy I had, and now I was wading through a house that felt hostile. Outside, wind knifed at the siding. The storm was picking up again. The lights flickered twice, threatening to leave me in the dark. I told myself to move. I needed to keep the damage from getting worse and to make sure I wasn't about to be electrocuted if a circuit blew. The pantry gave up a sleeve of stale crackers and a dusty jar of peanut butter. I ate standing up, staring at the ceiling like I could will it to knit itself closed. When the power steadied, I grabbed a towel for my hands and headed for the stairs to the basement. The steps were damp, slick with footprints I'd carried from the kitchen, and I gripped the railing hard as I went down. The smell hit me halfway. Wet wood, old concrete, a metallic tang that made the back of my tongue taste sour. Water had pooled across the low side of the basement. Cardboard boxes drank it up and sagged inward like collapsed lungs. I splashed toward the electrical panel, telling myself to move slow and keep my head clear. The panel door stuck. When I tugged harder, my shoe slid on the film of water and I pitched forward, instinctively throwing out my hand to catch myself. My palm slammed against the metal and a white-hot shock shot up my arm, snapping my teeth together. I choked out a sound that wasn't a scream, more breath than voice, and fell sideways onto the wet floor. A warm slide crossed my temple. For a second, I thought it was more water. When I pressed my fingers there, they came away red. I rolled onto my knees, dizzy and sick, and pushed toward the stairs. Each step was a test I wasn't sure I'd pass. The railing felt a mile away even when my hand was on it. Halfway up, I had to sit, head buzzing, vision shrinking at the edges. The house groaned around me, the temperature dropping instead of rising. My hands had gone numb. My toes followed. Some part of my brain tried to be practical. Hypothermia creeps. It seduces. Don't lie down. Don't fall asleep. Another thought whispered that the furnace might be throwing off exhaust into a house I'd sealed tight against the cold. Carbon monoxide doesn't have a smell. It just steals the air and convinces you you're only tired. I told myself to get up, to make it to the living room, to call for help. My phone was on the coffee table, the distance from the stairs to the couch no more than a dozen steps. But it felt like crossing a field in a blizzard. I made it to the main floor and crawled the last few feet, but by then my body had decided it was done listening. I collapsed with my cheek against the rug. The room swam in and out. Somewhere far away, a high, insistent beeping started and wouldn't quit. A small and terrible relief uncurled in my chest. If I drifted, maybe I'd see Ethan. Maybe the noise in my head would finally quiet. The last image I carried with me was water slipping under the front door, spreading into a glittering river down the steps. Later, I learned that Megan Carter saw it from the sidewalk on her way back from the store. She tried my number first and then walked up, knocking hard. When she heard an alarm blaring inside with no one answering, she called 911 and stayed on the line, describing what she could see. The firefighters forced the door and found me on the floor, skin cold to the touch, lips gray. They moved fast in a practiced blur. Windows opened to clear the air, the furnace shut down, a monitor clipped to my finger. "She's hypothermic," someone said. Another voice mentioned carbon monoxide, and the words braided themselves with the buzzing that had taken over my thoughts. They strapped me to a gurney, wrapped me in blankets, and someone pressed a mask over my face. The world narrowed to the rush of oxygen and the ache of my lungs trying to catch up. One of them told Megan that if they'd gotten there much later, things could have gone another way. In the ambulance, they started warm IV fluids and kept talking to me like I could answer. I tried to meet their voices, but my mind kept slipping. Portland's skyline flickered through the window and was gone. We reached Portland General Hospital and bright lights swallowed everything. At some point, I floated enough to feel gloved hands at my hairline. They cleaned and stitched the cut at my temple, counted heartbeats and watched for any rhythm that didn't belong, and treated the burns along my wrist where the shock had traveled. A nurse stayed long after the doctor moved on, asking simple questions in a voice that anchored me to the bed. She wrote notes in my chart, pausing to look at me the way you look at someone you would like to help and don't quite know how. When I told her, in my fog, that there wasn't really anyone I could call to come get me, her face changed. She added a line about limited support at home and tucked the blanket closer around my shoulders. By late afternoon, the edges of my world had stopped spinning enough that I could hold a cup of water without spilling it. A nurse checked my vitals, asked about pain, and told me the doctors wanted to watch my labs overnight. "We'll figure out next steps in the morning," she said, adding in a quiet tone that the hospital had social workers who could help with practical matters. She glanced at my chart again at the line about limited support at home, then back to my face like she wanted to make sure I'd heard her. A local reporter drifted in with a press badge and careful manners. "Storm coverage," he explained. "Frozen pipes, power outages, the string of carbon monoxide calls." One of the firefighters had mentioned that I'd just flown home from a funeral. "I'm Daniel Park," he said, softer now. "Would you be open to sharing a little? It might help folks understand what these nights are doing to people." I didn't have energy for a long story. I told him as much as I could manage without crying. The flight, the house, the ceiling spilling, the alarm, how a neighbor named Megan wouldn't walk away. I said Ethan's name and watched him write it down, then erased the last name when I shook my head. He didn't push. He asked if he could talk to Megan and the crew who'd brought me in. I gave him her address and tried not to imagine the mess he'd find if he walked past my house. By the time evening fell, the room felt smaller, the machines louder. I dozed and woke to my phone buzzing against the tray table, messages stacking faster than I could read. A friend had texted a link to a news site with a line, "You need to see this." So I tapped it with a thumb that still shook. The video opened with snow-glossed streets and cracked pipes spraying like fountains. Then came a shot of my block, warped a little by the camera lens, and the front steps where water had made a bright ribbon across the concrete. Megan stood on the sidewalk in a winter hat, telling the story like she was still on the phone with 911, hands braced in her pockets to keep from shaking. A firefighter described what they'd seen when they forced the door. Daniel's voiceover threaded it together. A woman recently back from overseas, a house gone cold, an alarm that didn't stop, a neighbor who would not ignore the sound. They blurred my face and didn't use my last name, but the part that punched air from my lungs came in the middle. Daniel said something about community and support, about how isolation can turn dangerous when emergencies pile up. Then on the screen, a cropped and anonymized screenshot from a group text appeared. the names and photos blocked out. You could still read what mattered. My message from the airport sat there in a pale bubble. No worries. Under it, the neat stack of replies that had told me to plan better, to catch a ride, to figure it out. The camera returned to Daniel before the bubbles scrolled further. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't have to. "What would you want people to take away from this?" he asked, his voice over a shot of Portland General Hospital's entrance, glowing against the dark. The answer came from another nurse on a different floor. "Check on people," she said. "Believe them when they say they need you. And if you're fine tonight, be someone's warmth." I read the comments until the words blurred. A hashtag began to attach itself to screenshots and reposts. No worries. First a few locals, then more. It wasn't neat or kind. People were angry on my behalf in ways I didn't know what to do with. Some of it made me flinch. Some of it made me feel seen. Then the phone calls started. An owner of a plumbing company left a message. "We're between jobs tomorrow. We can assess and at least get that line capped." A restoration service offered equipment to dry the floors and run air scrubbers once the furnace was safe. Someone managing community outreach for Riverview Hotel said they had a room available for a week if I needed a warm place to land, no charge, with shuttle rides to and from appointments. 2 restaurants near our old date night spot sent emails about meal vouchers. A volunteer wrote to ask if she could organize a list for rides and errands. A hardware store employee said he'd bring space heaters if I wanted them for the short term. The flood of offers didn't fix what had broken, but it pushed back the edge of the cliff I'd been standing on since I got off the plane. I listened to each voicemail all the way through like a ritual, then saved them and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. Not long after the segment aired, my family arrived as a cluster. The door swung back and there they were. My mother's coat still dotted with snow, my father's jaw tight, Brandon and Katie hovering behind them. For a beat, they took me in. The bandage at my temple, the hospital gown, the tangle of wires. Relief didn't lead. "We didn't know it was this public," my mother said, smoothing down her scarf like she could iron out the whole situation. "People are calling me." The Beckers texted. Someone at church sent the link. She glanced at my phone like it might be recording. My father's voice followed, measured and managerial. "How did those messages end up on television?" he asked. "They were private." He looked everywhere but at my eyes. "There's context missing." Brandon shoved his hands into his pockets and lifted his chin. "It looks bad," he said, like he was reporting weather and not my life. "You know how people twist things online." Katie stepped closer and touched the bed rail with her fingertips. "We would have picked you up if we'd known you needed it," she said quickly, already defending herself. "Yesterday was crazy and you weren't clear." I thought of me at PDX, fingers numb, typing the smallest ask and then the smallest shield when it was refused. No worries. I could still feel the stiff tile under my knees at baggage claim, the way the tape crinkled around Ethan's suitcase. "I'm okay," I said, because I didn't have space for their spin right then. "I'm here, that's enough for tonight." They took turns telling me what they'd been doing all day, who had called them, which neighbors might be talking. My mother worried aloud about gossip, about how the Coopers followed the news too closely, about the way this kind of attention could snowball. My father suggested we put out our own message to correct impressions. He used phrases like optics and narrative. My head throbbed. A nurse eased in to check the monitor, her presence a soft interruption. She spoke to me first, pain scale, dizziness, whether I was warm enough, and then, with professional patience, let my family know that visiting hours would wrap soon. "Tomorrow," she said, "your team will talk through a discharge plan. If there are folks who can help at home, we can coordinate with them. And if not, we'll look at other options so you don't end up right back here." My mother latched onto the first part. "Of course we'll help," she said, and then glanced at my father as if cueing him to nod. He nodded. Brandon stared at the floor. Katie arranged the flowers she'd set down so they faced me better, as if angles could make them smell like care. The nurse looked at me again, and something in the way she waited made my lungs expand a little easier. I realized I had been bracing for the only plan I'd ever been allowed to have. Go where I was told, smile through the parts that hurt, pretend it was fine. The phone buzzed with another voicemail from a stranger offering warmth. I tucked the blanket up to my collarbone and told myself I didn't have to decide anything in front of an audience. My family left in a swirl of coat sleeves and whispered logistics. My mother kissed the air near my cheek and promised they'd be back early. My father told me to rest, his words the right shape and the wrong temperature. When the door clicked shut behind them, the room settled. I pressed play on the newest message. It was from Riverview Hotel again, a woman with a calm voice saying the room would wait and that if I needed longer than a week, they'd figure something out. "We're sorry for your loss," she added, like a blessing. "Let us make this small part easier." I let the phone rest on my chest and watched the monitor blink its rhythm. Out in the city, pipes were still bursting and alarms were still wailing. But in that square of fluorescent-lit quiet, I felt something shift. Strangers were offering more than words. Tomorrow, when the doctors asked about plans and my family tried to narrate my life, I would have something else to say. Morning found me clearer than I'd been in days. My head still throbbed, but the room had edges again. A nurse with kind eyes, Hannah, checked my temp, asked about the spinning, and told me the team would round soon. "You're stable," she said, tucking the blanket like she was sealing warmth in. "We'll talk about where you'll heal best." Dr. Parker came with a small flock, a resident, a case manager, and a woman in a blazer who introduced herself as Ms. Shaw from social work. They spoke in turns, unhurried. My labs were improving. The carbon monoxide was out of my system. The hypothermia would resolve with rest and warmth. The concussion would take longer. "What we don't want," Dr. Parker said, "is for you to leave here and end up right back because your home isn't safe yet." She asked what support I had in place. I told them about the offers, the plumber willing to cap the line, the restoration crew ready to dry the house once the furnace could be run without risk, the Riverview hotel room with a shuttle for appointments. Ms. Shaw nodded and took notes. "That's real support," she said. "We can coordinate timing and make sure you're not trying to quarterback this alone." My family arrived halfway through, snowflakes melting on their coats. My mother slipped into a chair and smiled like the room was a camera. My father stayed standing, hands in his pockets, profile set. Brandon and Katie leaned against the wall, a too-casual chorus. "We're here to help with discharge," my father said, as if he'd been asked. "We'll take her home with us. We can manage the details from there." He glanced at Ms. Shaw, already negotiating. "It's best to keep this within the family." Miss Arja didn't look away from me. "Lauren," she said, "what would you like?" It was so simple I almost missed it. I swallowed, felt the stitches in my temple pull, and tried to match my voice to the steadiness I wanted. "I want the plan that keeps me safe and warm," I said. "I want the hotel. I want the plumber and the restoration service scheduled, and I want someone to check the furnace before I set foot back in the house." My mother blinked. "Sweetheart, appearances matter," she said softly, like stepping on a bruise. "People are already talking. If you stay with us, we can control the message." "The message?" The word tasted metallic. "Last night was a message," I said. "The pipes bursting, the alarm, me on the floor. The message was, I can't do this alone." Brandon shifted. "No one's saying that," he offered. "We're just saying the hotel is a lot. It looks like you're..." "Accepting help?" I said. "Yes, that's exactly what it looks like." Dr. Parker kept her voice neutral. "A hotel with support services is a common bridge while a home is remediated," she said. "Given the risk factors, I support it." My father tried a different door. "We didn't know you needed picking up," he said, ignoring the way Hannah's pen paused. "There were moving parts. Yesterday's segment wasn't the start," I said, and heard something in me click into place. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. At PDX, I asked for a ride. You told me to plan better. I got home to a house that hadn't been warmed, no groceries, no one who'd checked the mail. When the ceiling opened and I called for help, I was told to try Angie's list and some how-tos. When I called you, Mom, you had church. Dad, you had an early morning. By the time the alarm went off, the person who showed up was a neighbor who didn't owe me anything. Silence settled like snowfall. Katie's eyes shone. She looked down. My mother's mouth opened and closed. My father stared at a point past my shoulder, recalculating. "I'm not angry the news ran it," I said, and realized it was true. I'm angry I had to become news to be believed. Hannah adjusted the pulse ox and pretended to fuss with a wire that didn't need fussing. "We can start calling Riverview this morning," she said to Ms. Shaw, but her eyes flicked to me like a threat of encouragement. Ms. Shaw nodded. "I'll confirm the room, arrange transport there directly from here, and contact the plumber and restoration team with access instructions. Do you have a spare key somewhere secure?" "There's a lockbox on the back gate," I said. "I can text you the code." My mother made one last try. "We could host you for a few days, make calls, be seen helping. People—" "Mom," I said, "I'm choosing the help that helps. You can visit, you can bring soup, you can sit with me while the adjuster calls, but I'm not going to your house to make anyone feel better about what they didn't do." Something raw flashed across her face, then smoothed into worry. "We don't want you to cut us off." "I don't want that either," I said. "I want boundaries. I need to trust that when I ask for something simple, I won't be told to figure it out. That if you can't do it, you'll say so kindly and offer what you can, not a lecture. That when I say I'm not okay, the response isn't about optics." Katie stepped forward first. "We can do that," she said, almost to herself. Brandon stared at the floor like it might give him a script. My father cleared his throat. "If this is your decision," he said, slow and careful, "then we'll support it." The word landed awkwardly, a new language he was trying on. "Let us know what time you'll be moved. We'll bring your coat." I nodded. "Thank you." The logistics began to braid themselves into a plan. Ms. Shaw stepped into the hall to coordinate with Riverview Hotel. Hannah updated the whiteboard with times for meds and discharge. Dr. Parker reviewed my concussion symptoms and what to watch for: headaches that spike, nausea that won't quit, words that don't line up. She asked if there was someone I trusted to be my eyes if I got turned around. "I can ask Megan to check in," I said. "And the hotel said they have a shuttle. Ms. Shaw is setting up rides for appointments." "That works," Dr. Parker said. "We'll also order a portable pulse ox and a thermometer, just to keep an eye on things the first few days." While forms printed, my phone buzzed with confirmation after confirmation. The plumbing company slotted me into a noon window and would cap the broken line, then return for a full repair once the city thawed. The restoration team would meet them, set up fans and dehumidifiers, and walk the house for hidden moisture. A furnace tech agreed to test for leaks and clear the exhaust before any heat came on. Riverview Hotel sent a message with my room number, a note about quiet floors, and a list of nearby places that would deliver hot meals. When Ms. Shaw came back, she handed me a simple, neat packet: addresses, times, contact names, a map from Portland General Hospital to the hotel. "Sign here," she said, tapping releases that would let the crews access the property and let the hotel charge incidentals to a fund that had been quietly arranged by donors who didn't need their names, said aloud. "And here, so the hospital can call me instead of your family if we need to coordinate anything urgent." My mother bristled. "We're her family," she said. "And Lauren is an adult," Ms. Shaw said, still calm. "She's choosing a point of contact who can be on the phone while she rests. You'll have her number. You can ask before you show up. That's how we protect her recovery and your relationships." I signed. My hand shook a little and then didn't. The pen felt like a weight I could finally set down. The last hour moved with an easy purpose. Hannah helped me into clean clothes, gentle around the bandage. Katie tied my shoes when bending made me lightheaded. Brandon carried the flowers to the nurse's station so they wouldn't get crushed in the transport. My father stood by the window and watched the gray sky, saying nothing for once. When transport arrived with a wheelchair, my mother squeezed my shoulder. "We'll see you later," she said. "Text us the time." "I will," I said. It wasn't a promise I would perform on their schedule. It was an agreement on mine. Out in the corridor, the hospital hummed with ordinary emergencies. Ms. Shaw walked beside me, reading out the plan once more, like a lullaby made of bullet points. At the entrance, a car from Riverview Hotel waited with the heat already on. Through the glass, the city looked sharp and bright, ice edged with sunlight. I glanced back and caught Hannah's wave, Dr. Parker's small nod. I lifted my hand in return. The doors opened. I felt the warm air on my face and the shape of a different kind of help settling around me. Chosen, specific, enough. Riverview Hotel felt like stepping into a warm pocket of air after weeks of holding my breath. The front desk had a small envelope with my name on it and a note on smooth paper. "Welcome. No rush. We've got you." The room itself was quiet and clean. A window facing the river, a chair by the heater, a blanket heavy enough to quiet the shaking in my bones. I slept like a stone the first night, not because grief let me, but because the cold finally did. Ms. Shaw kept the threads moving. The plumber met the restoration team at the house the next day and capped the split line. Fans and dehumidifiers throbbed to life. A furnace tech tested the exhaust and replaced a vent that had iced over. When the crews sent photos, I stared at the rooms I knew by heart and almost didn't recognize them. Puddles gone, baseboards pried up, drywall cut in clean squares like someone had taken bites out of the walls. It looked like surgery. It also looked like a chance to build the house back safer than it had been. I made a routine at the hotel. Short walks in the hallway to see if my balance was steady, warm showers that didn't end with my teeth clacking, soup and bread delivered by kind strangers who insisted on leaving notes with hearts. Twice a week, I sat with a therapist who kept the room still while I said my husband's name out loud. Once a week, I went to a grief group where we passed tissues and told the truth. It helped to be among people who didn't flinch when tears came without warning. Megan checked on the house for me, texting photos of meters and thermostats like she'd been doing it her whole life. On Saturdays, Adam shoveled my sidewalk before the sun finished rising, and Luke fixed the porch light that had burned out, the one that had greeted me with darkness. Grace left a casserole on the hotel front desk with my name written in block letters and a line, "You're not alone." They didn't ask for a performance of gratitude, didn't pitch advice like it was a contest. They did ordinary things as if ordinary things could hold a person up. My family sent messages, some helpful, some more about how they looked inside the story than about the story itself. I replied when I had the energy, short and clear. I told them exactly what I could accept. Visits at the hotel during visiting hours, no unannounced drop-ins, texts if they wanted to bring food rather than showing up with it. I offered small jobs, call the insurance adjuster, confirm a delivery window, and watched how each one landed. Sometimes they followed through, sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, I let the silence stand. It wasn't a punishment, it was a line I could finally see. By the third week, the house hummed with machines. Moisture readings dropped from scary to manageable. The crews replaced drywall in clean squares and painted in broad, steady strokes. We installed a smarter thermostat, new smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, and sensors that would yell if water ever ran where it shouldn't. A plumber added an automatic shutoff at the main. An electrician labeled the panel in thick marker and showed me how to throw the right breakers without touching anything live. I taped a copy nearby in case panic made me forget. The first time I walked back through the front door, it smelled like new paint and dry wood. I stood in the entryway and listened for the old sounds, pipes complaining, a furnace too quiet, the thin whine that had turned into an alarm, and heard only air moving the way it should. I moved slowly, touched the wall like a person who doesn't entirely trust the ground, and thanked the empty rooms for holding. That night, I returned to the hotel anyway. It felt right to go home on purpose, not on a dare. Healing came in increments. My head stopped buzzing at the edges. The purple at my temple turned yellow, then faded. I could read 3 pages in a row without losing the thread, then 4, then a chapter. I learned what triggers looked like. The first time a smoke detector test beeped, my knees went soft and I had to sit in the hallway until my breath caught up. I told my therapist about it, and she taught me to stand in a doorway and name what I could see. A blue mug, a frayed rug, the clock ticking toward an ordinary hour. When it was safe, I moved back in. Megan met me at the door with coffee and a box of batteries. Adam carried the last of the hotel bags. Luke installed a simple lockbox on the back gate so I could stop worrying about who had the spare key. Grace stood in my kitchen and asked where I wanted plates now that the cabinet shelves had shifted. We created a small group text for our side of the block, a list of practical updates and the kinds of questions that can rescue an afternoon. Anyone need salt? My ladder's free. Who knows a decent roofer? I felt the angle of my life tilt towards something steadier. Work gave me space to ramp up again. I answered emails in brief bursts and learned to end a day without wringing it dry. Holidays crept close, and I let them be smaller than they used to be. I visited Riverview Hotel's lobby once to drop off thank you notes and left with a hug from the woman who had called me that first night. "You're doing it," she said. "One thing at a time." 6 months after the funeral, I did the thing that made the most sense when I thought about who Ethan was. He had been far from home when everything changed. He'd been held by coworkers and new friends who barely knew him and still showed up. So I started the Ethan Walker Memorial Scholarship, a small fund for international students who needed emergency help, rent during a visa delay, the fee for a replacement passport, a plane ticket home when home wasn't optional. Miss Shaw put me in touch with the right people to make it real. Daniel Park, who had told my story without using my last name, sent a short note to ask if I'd accept a quiet mention in a community roundup. I said yes. He kept it quiet. At the launch gathering, we kept the room bright and the speeches short. Megan stood at the back with Adam and Luke and Grace, all of them waving when I turned to look. Friends came, and a few of Ethan's old co-workers joined via a shaky video call from Singapore. My family texted that they were sorry. Something had come up. I believed them and still felt the familiar hollow. Then the hollow eased a little when Chloe stepped to the microphone, her voice careful as she thanks everyone. She'd had a visa snag in her first semester and chosen between rent and a flight to meet with a consulate officer in person. The scholarship had bridged it. "I can stay," she said, breathless with relief. "I can finish." Afterward, I slipped outside into air that smelled like rain and cut grass. My phone buzzed with messages, photos from the room, a link to the funds page, a neighbor asking if I'd made it home okay. I looked back through the window at the people gathered there because they wanted to be, not because they were supposed to be. I thought about Ethan's watch on my wrist and the night a stranger's voice in a hotel had sounded like a blessing. I thought about the porch light that now turned on every time I came up the steps. Home didn't go back to what it had been. It became the place I kept safe with the help I chose, the people who responded when I asked, and the boundaries that made space for both. Some days, it still felt like walking on a bridge I was building under my own feet. On those days, I texted the neighbor chat or sat at my grief group and let someone pass me a tissue without asking why. And on other days, I cooked a simple meal and ate it at the kitchen table with the heat humming through the vents. And I told myself out loud, "This is warmth, and you're allowed to have it." The letter came in an envelope with my father's handwriting, careful and dark. Inside, he didn't make a speech. He wrote that he'd watch the segment and then the replay in his head, and he couldn't stop seeing the parts where he could have done more and didn't. He said he was sorry for the night at PDX and the hours that followed, for acting like logistics were love and acting like optics were care. He asked for a chance to try again, this time on my terms. He promised to listen if I set the terms. I wrote back and kept it plain. We could try lunch in a neutral place once or twice a month, just the two of us to start. No surprise guests, 1 hour. If the talk turned to optics, we'd change the subject. If I said I was done for the day, we'd stop. If he wanted to help, it would be specific and simple, not a strategy to manage what other people thought. He replied with a yes that didn't argue with any of it. The first lunch was at a small cafe where no one knew us. He wore the same winter coat I'd seen at the hospital and kept his hands around a mug like he was warming them through. For a while, we talked about weather and roads, then about the scholarship. He said he'd read the page twice and that the idea felt right in his chest. He also said that when the news clip ran, he kept thinking of what people might assume about him and not of what I'd been living. "Pride is a stupid heater," he said, looking down. "It throws heat in the wrong direction." I told him that naming it out loud helped. He nodded and didn't try to fix the rest with a sentence. After a few lunches, my mother asked to join one. We met another day at the same cafe, and she came with a bag of sliced fruit and a stack of questions about my appointments, the kind that can be answered in 10 words. When she started to edge toward how someone from church had asked about me, she caught herself and asked what soup I liked instead. It wasn't a repair and then a credit. It was small and steady. I left when my head started to throb and texted later to say thank you for the fruit. She sent back a heart and didn't add a paragraph. That counted. Time kept stacking around the empty space Ethan left. I learned how to look at the calendar without flinching. The house felt like mine again, not because it forgot, but because it held what remained. The scholarship sent out its first few grants. Chloe wrote a note with too many exclamation points that made me laugh in a way that didn't hurt. On some afternoons, the neighbor thread chimed about ladders and borrowed spices, and I answered right away. On others, I let it sit and took a walk by the river with my hands tucked in my sleeves. A year after the funeral, I booked a seat to Singapore. I packed the watch I'd given Ethan for our 5th anniversary, tucked it into the same carry-on pocket as before. The flight felt longer on the way back than it had ever felt on the way there. Heat greeted me at the door of the terminal, a wave that smelled like jet fuel and wet stone. The city was the same and not the same. It held our old roots like lines drawn in invisible ink. I brought flowers to the cemetery and took my time finding the marker, even though I knew exactly where to go. The ground was neat, the shade gentle. I sat on the grass and told him everything I could fit into the quiet. The cold house, the alarm, the people who stepped in and the people who looked away, the way the hotel room had felt like a hand on my back. I told him about Megan and Adam and Luke and Grace, about Hannah and Dr. Parker, about how Miss Shaw could make a plan sound like a lullaby. I told him about Chloe and her visa and her relief. I told him my father had written a letter with real words in it, and that we were trying something new, not big, but honest. When the sun moved, I stood and wandered the city he had mapped for me over video calls. I rode the train lines he'd learned by heart. I ate at a hawker stall where the same dish tasted both familiar and different, and I let the noise wrap around me without apology. Later, I met 2 people from his old team for coffee. They told me the jokes he'd told and the ways he'd been exact without making anyone feel small. We said his name out loud the right number of times. On my last morning, I went back to the cemetery and left a small stone on the edge of the marker, a quiet sign that I had been there. I slipped his watch onto my wrist and listened to the tick I couldn't really hear but knew was there. "I'm still here," I said, because saying it in that place mattered. "I'm still moving." The flight home felt lighter in a way that wasn't about luggage. I unlocked my front door and the porch light came on the way it should. Inside, the furnace hummed. The detectors blinked their steady reassurance. The thermostat screen glowed the number I'd set. The group chat on my block pinged to ask if anyone needed milk. I typed that I was okay and that the sunset over the river looked good from the plane. It didn't turn into a movie after that. It stayed human-sized. My family and I kept meeting for lunch, sometimes with my mother, sometimes just with my father, sometimes not at all if I didn't have the energy. When they slipped, I said so. When they did better, I said that too. The neighbors stayed neighbors, which is to say, they were a kind of family I got to choose. The scholarship kept going. On quiet nights, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and said Ethan's name out loud because the sound still needed somewhere to live. If you're standing in a doorway wondering whether asking for help will make things worse, this is the smallest truth I can offer. Boundaries are a kind of warmth. They don't fix the weather, but they keep the cold from getting in as fast. Choose the help that helps. Let people show you who they are. And when the good ones find you, let them stay.